Hello and welcome to an exciting Eve of Poll Peston programme as we're joined by leading politicians across the country to help you choose who you want in charge.
We'll dig into the data. Can we really trust the polls which point to a decisive victory for Labour, or could they be wrong?
Coming up first, I'll ask the Home Secretary, James Cleverly, whether he agrees with his predecessor, Suella Braverman, that the Tories have already lost.
And I'll ask Johnny Reynolds, the Shadow Business Secretary, how Labour would pay for the scale of change they say the country needs.
Adrian Ramsey, the co-Green leader, will tell us whether we can address climate change and not become poorer. And throughout the show, telling us what the Tory party will need to do after the election, we have Baroness Davidson, while playwriting maestro James Graham will discuss when to sack football managers and when to sack political managers. Watcher, here's what made this election different and I think some would say maddening and disappointing. There were those revelations that Tory candidates and officials bet on the date of the election rather than focusing on winning the election. There was actually only today, a wannabe Tory leader, Suella Braverman, saying that Rishi Sunak's attacks on racist remarks made by reform officials and candidates have less force because the Tory party kept millions of pounds from a donor who made racist remarks. And an actual Tory leader has seemingly conceded defeat, that's Rishi Sunak, before polling day by saying the vote is all about making sure Labour wins only a normal majority, not what Sunak calls a super one. So what are the issues that most of us felt should have been discussed but barely were? Well, for starters, there's how to manage the risks and rewards of the most far-reaching industrial revolution of modern times. That's the AI industrial revolution. There's what kind of military and defence capability would be necessary to protect ourselves from the military threats of Putin, China, cybercrime and the rest. How to avoid deep cuts in public services after 2025 that are baked into spending plans underwritten by the Tories and Labour at a time when our prisons are overflowing, waiting lists for NHS treatment are still rising and teachers remain demoralised. There was so much that was missing, and it was perhaps in keeping with this systematic displacement activity that the final argument from the Prime Minister has been that Keir Starmer may not be fit to lead Britain because he wants Friday nights with his kids. Really? Is that the problem? Now, the nutshell of the two parties' slightly less trivial arguments are from the Tories: Labour will put up your taxes and we'll cut them. From Labour, we won't put up your taxes and we'll encourage investment by promoting economic stability and dismantling planning restrictions. And that's about it. So, does what some would say has been a maddening general election matter? I suspect not. The die for tomorrow's vote was probably cast long before Sunak announced 4th of July would be the day. And if he loses, we've learned today that he can cheer himself up by having one of those sandwiches he loves. Anushka.
Thank you, Robert. We are pretty much there, and so I can show you our final campaign tracker from UK in a changing Europe. Sophie Stowers has been tracking the party leaders around the country, and her research underlines the strategies that they've been running. For Rishi Sunak, a really defensive campaign. He has visited Conservative constituencies with an average of almost 14,000 Tory majority, with the visits increasingly to safe Tory seats as the campaign went on. Keir Starmer has been doing the opposite. He's been going to Tory seats too, but an average majority of over 11,000, the odd SNP and Green as well, which require an average 13% swing to be won by Starmer's party. Tomorrow, the Lib Dems also on the attack, targeting majorities over 9,000 in places like the Blue Wall, the South West and across coastal areas. So has it affected the polls? As Robert suggested, not massively. Reform are up here and Labour down. The Tories went down too. They've rallied a little bit at the end, but the gap is still pretty good. And we have had the march of the MRP polls that try to translate it all into seat projections. They are still coming in today. They all have Labour well ahead. But look at the span in terms of Conservative seat projections, from almost wipe out 53 seats, according to Savanta, up to 126 for More in Common. Now, why the span? This, from the FT, helps explain the uncertainty. It maps the relationship between the Conservative vote share along the bottom and Conservative seats up here. And what is really interesting is that a small change in the vote share from just under 20% here to around 25% leads to a sharp increase or a sharp decline in the number of seats because of loads of marginal seats, which is why the Tories think that 100 of those could still make a big difference.
Fascinating stuff, Anushka. Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be joined by James Cleverly, the Home Secretary. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, James. You will have heard Mel Stride, read Suella Braverman today saying it's all over for you, even before people go to the polls tomorrow. They're right, aren't they?
Well, firstly, that's not what Mel said. Mel said if the polls are accurate, and that is a big if.
I've heard him back, Home Secretary. That's not quite what he said. He was talking as though it was a done deal. But anyway, just tell me what you think.
So he said if the polls are right, and the point is we know the polls are not a prediction and they're certainly not an instruction. And just as you've just seen, just as your viewers have seen with that analysis, this election is still very much in the hands of the voters. The MRP polls are not gospel. The voters will decide this election, and what we know is that a modest number of voters in a modest number of seats could make a real difference between a runaway Labour Party that will take the country, I think, in completely the wrong direction. Rachel Reeves, one of Rachel Reeves' key advisors today, we discover, believes that we should be taxing pensioners, taxing people's homes higher, or a Conservative government which has brought inflation down, kept the economy growing, kept unemployment low, cut carbon emissions faster than any other developed nation in the world, and those are the real options.
But I've just got to check what you mean by that, because you appear, but you do appear to be saying that the choice is between a very big majority or just a normal majority. It does seem to me, you just said to me, there is no route to victory for you.
No, Robert, what I'm saying is that a relatively modest number of people, 130,000 people spread over around 100 or so constituencies, could make a huge difference.
It can make a huge difference, but it's between a normal-sized majority for Labour and a super majority. It's not. None of that gives you victory.
Look, Robert, you keep telling me what I'm saying rather than listening to what I'm saying.
OK.
So the point is, the vast majority of votes have not been cast. If people decide that they want to keep the economic stability that we've now seen under Rishi Sunak, who's brought inflation down from 11% to 2%, who's kept unemployment low, we've seen record levels of international inward investment in the UK. We have seen more police officers on the streets here in Essex, more police officers on the streets than ever in this constabulary's history. These are the things that we're putting forward. And then,
sorry, Home Secretary, at the same time, we know that the prisons
really make a difference.
Hang on, at the same time, Home Secretary, we know the prisons are overflowing. You know, waiting lists in the NHS still rising. Whoever wins the election, you're leaving a poisonous legacy.
We are leaving. We went into this election with a solid economic base. That gives us the opportunity to keep moving forward if we make the right decisions. And you talk about prisons. I'm Home Secretary. I am very happy that having more police officers on the streets mean more people are being arrested. Serious criminals are now serving longer sentences because we've scrapped the Labour release at the halfway point as a standard. And we are making sure that the most serious criminals are serving longer. And now, because of COVID, we have had pressures on the prison service because we decided to prioritise the safety of communities rather than the safety of people in prison. And actually, we were proven to be able to keep both safe, so I don't regret that for a moment. That means that there's been some short-term pressure. But you talk about waiting lists. Hang on,
I've got a lot to get through, Home Secretary.
Long waits in Wales.
Okay.
But long
You've made
waits
this
in
point
Wales,
so many times during this election campaign, and for reasons that nobody can quite understand. You're not cutting through with it, but I do need to ask you some other questions, Home Secretary.
You cut me off when I highlight the fact that Labour-run Wales, the NHS waiting lists are in a considerably worse state than Conservative-run English NHS.
You've made that argument, as you have repeatedly through this campaign. So I need to put another couple of questions. In terms of unusual things that you don't often see in a campaign, you know, a very senior member of your party, your immediate predecessor as Home Secretary, wrote today that the Prime Minister's criticisms of racist remarks made by Reform candidates and officials weren't cutting through with voters because you kept millions of pounds given to the Tory party by Frank Hester, who everybody at your level have said made racist remarks.
And Frank has apologised, and he has apologised sincerely. But that is in stark contrast to the
but I'm
Reform
asking you
candidates.
about one of your colleagues attacking the Prime Minister on the eve of poll.
And the point I'm making is that I don't agree with the point she's making, because the equating what was said with what Reform candidates have said, and it's racist, it's misogynistic, critical of Her late Majesty the Queen, echoing Putin's excuses for invading Ukraine, suggesting that Churchill should have appeased Hitler. So a one-off incident, which was where there was an immediate and sincere apology, compared with this catalogue of totally inappropriate comments by the candidates and senior officials of a political party, I think are fundamentally different. So I don't agree with her. And actually, in the conversations that I'm having on the doorstep, people are telling me, people who were thinking of voting Reform and who are changing their minds because they realise that the comments made over and over again by a number of people in that party are completely at odds with their philosophy, their viewpoint, and their belief in what the British political system should be.
Now, we're almost out of time. I saw you on the stump last night with the return of Boris Johnson. You looked absolutely thrilled to see him there. Would your party be in this dire position if he was still leader?
Well, that's a pointless question, Robert, it really is, because he's not leader. But the reason I was pleased, because I've said, and I've been asked about this before, I want to see the whole Conservative family pulling together for the country, saving the country from this high-tax Labour party, because we know, you know, that they will put up taxes. And the voters that I speak to tell me that they know a Labour government would put up taxes. So when the whole Conservative family pulls together, as I say, the outcome of this election is not going to be dictated to the voters by opinion pollsters. It is in their hands, and I'm really glad that the full Conservative family, the full tribe, are all campaigning to protect this country from the dire circumstances that would inevitably be the case under a Labour government.
Home Secretary, as always, we're very grateful to have you on the show and hope to see you soon. I'm now going to go to Ruth Davidson. Ruth, very good to see you. I will try not to make to put questions that the Home Secretary regards as pointless to you. So I'm going to start by asking...
If you do, I'll tell you, Robert.
I know you will. You'll never want to mince your words. But I would like to know, look, it is possible that every opinion poll is wrong. That is possible. But they all say you are heading to quite a big defeat. Why do you think it may turn out to be terrible for you?
Well, look, first of all, the Home Secretary is absolutely right. You know, we have about 20% of people on postal votes, so 80% of votes haven't been cast yet. So literally any combination of results are possible at this time. If you look at what is likely, the polls have been pretty firm on the idea that this is going to be a Labour victory and there's going to be a change of government, which after 14 years and after some of the challenges that the country's faced is not necessarily that's unexpected. I do think that there were probably some things that we could have done in this campaign that would have tightened the ship a little bit. It seems to have been, to me, quite a confused campaign. But in terms of the fundamentals of whether this Prime Minister, whether Rishi Sunak has worked hard to make sure that the economic credibility has been restored in this country, that we've got a good economic foundation. I think he's done that. And I think that this campaign would have been better if we'd majored on that for a much greater percentage of the campaign than talking about things like national service and then dropping it, talking about security and defence and then not being able to because of D-Day. You know, so there's been a lot of confusion in the way the campaign has been run for me.
I mean, there is no question that they inherited dire economic circumstances, and Hunt as Chancellor and Sunak as Prime Minister have restored a degree of stability. Why do you think they are apparently getting so little credit for any of that from voters?
I think part of it is because we've had 5 prime ministers that have all been Conservatives, and each of them have undone things that the previous one have. So there's not much of a narrative about the kind of Conservative years, both in coalition and then in single points. But I do think as well that there was a period in the middle of this campaign where there was some traction, where actually this idea that if you vote Labour, it will cost you. You can vote for them, but it will cost you because they've said they won't put up taxes on working people, but they haven't said what they will put up taxes on. And it got the journalists asking questions of Labour about, does that mean that it's going to be on inheritance tax or on business taxes or on property taxes? And they were under the cosh a little bit. And then for whatever reason, we kind of went back to culture war stuff and whether Starmer's supposed to spend time with his kids on a Friday night or not. And you know, there was that period for about a week and a half where we were actually applying some pressure on Labour, and then it all just seemed to dissipate again. So I think, you know, in terms of looking at how the campaign was run, that's probably a bit disappointing. But again, it comes back to the fundamentals. You know, you can either win on leadership or the economy. If you're behind on both, you seldom win elections in this country. There was an economic story that we could have majored on there and majored on a lot harder. And we had good economic news coming in throughout the 6-week campaign. And it baffles me as to why we didn't do more on it.
Ruth, I'm going to come back to you in a minute. James, just very briefly, I want to talk to you at greater length later, but you immersed yourself when writing your play Labour of Love in that sort of atmosphere leading up to the 1997 Blair victory. How different does this atmosphere today feel ahead of tomorrow's poll?
It does feel different. The inheritance that Blair had was a stronger economy and I think a more confident mood, thinking back to that euphoria of Euro 96. It felt like even though the country had lost patience with the scandal-ridden Conservative Party, they hadn't lost their sense of hope or belief in government being able to do good. I do feel like this, I mean, tomorrow is still going to be extraordinary, no matter what. Even if people are trying to put a measurement on their excitement, if it is a landslide, and we don't know, but if it is a landslide, I think I'll defer to you, Anushka. But I think it's the first time ever that would have been a landslide for one party 5 years ago in 2019, through to the landslide for an entirely different party the next. That would be historic. Keir Starmer would be only the 7th Labour Prime Minister in history. It looks like he may get the largest majority any Prime Minister has had. The Conservative Party may have the worst result they've ever had, and they are statistically the most successful electoral force of all time. Right. Will Cabinet Ministers lose their posts? You know, the famous Portillo moment. It might actually be a Portillo avalanche. We might lose a Chancellor. We might lose a... You know, there are things that will be interesting and dramatic and exciting tomorrow, but I don't feel like quite yet the optimism and hope and belief is there that was there in 97.
James, much more to discuss with you, but Anushka, your you've got something for us.
Yes, that's right. My screenie has been taken over by Labour's Shadow Business Secretary, Johnny Reynolds. Johnny, I'm delighted to have you join me. Can I ask you something? If Labour wins this election tomorrow, does the size of the victory matter?
Well, good evening. Look, nothing has been decided yet, but it is almost decision time. And what we are seeking is a mandate for change. So if Labour were to win, the size of any victory wouldn't determine what we did. The agenda is there, but it would give us, if we got that backing from the British people, the mandate to do the things that we think are necessary to turn this country around. And I would simply say to anyone, it hasn't been decided yet, but if you do want change, you do want better than what you've had for the last 14 years, please come out and vote for it. That is the way you will get the change that you're looking for.
Just to be clear, if the polls are to be believed, you could be in a situation where on a vote share of 40% or less, maybe even less than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2017, you could get a huge majority. Do you think that's fair?
Well, I don't think that anyone should be speculating about that sort of thing. I'm a bit of a sceptic. There's a big variance in some of the MRP polls that have been published, quite rightly, because people don't really know. The only thing that will determine the election is people coming out to vote tomorrow.
Okay,
and if they don't vote, they won't get changed.
You've made that point, but the reason I'm asking you this is, Johnny, I've watched your career as a politician since you first became one in 2010, and I've watched you in Parliament, and I remember 9 years ago when you said that first past the post was a broken system, and you said that a proportional vote was a patriotic vote. Do you still think that?
Look, I've always had views on how the system compares to, say, other countries and how we do elections. But look, it's a system that we have. I've lost elections under that system, and I hope one day to experience winning elections under that system. The simple fact is, and I think it is to the credit of the Labour Party, that if you look at the constituencies up and down the country, there is really only one political party that is competitive in all parts of the UK, and that is the Labour Party. And because we have that, that gives us a chance to form the government.
I just want to ask you one more question on this, because we know what you believe, we've heard what you've said, and tomorrow the Reform UK party could get 13% of the vote if the polls are to be believed, but only get one seat or maybe no seats. Do you still think that that would be an unfair result?
Look, I think it's the system that we have, and I think having experienced defeat under that system, you know, I'd like to experience a win under that system. I don't think we can say there's only a problem with the system if the Conservatives aren't winning. But we don't know the result yet. It's all down to people. If people come out to vote, they will get the result that they want.
Stay there for me, because I want to ask you lots more after the break. But right now, we're going to the break. Please keep watching afterwards.
Welcome back. Lots more from James Graham and Johnny Reynolds in a minute. But first, Anushka.
Thank you. I want to show you this really interesting polling from More in Common, asking people if politicians are talking too much about a subject, that is in red here, if they're talking the right amount about it, in grey, or if they are not talking enough, in purple. Now, this is subbed down a bit. We've got the top of the list and the bottom of the list. So top of the list is the debate around trans people. 16% of people want more on that. 27% think it is about right. But the largest for any issue, 38%, think it has been too big a focus in this campaign. While down here, 52% think there hasn't been enough focus on crime. 58% wanted to hear more on the cost of living, and 59% really wanted more on social care. Only 44% think that they were talking too much about that. And yet it is an issue where the King's Fund, for example, have been very critical of the Conservative government on social care, but actually about Labour too. Simon Bottery says that UK Labour's manifesto is shadowboxing on social care, with only one major policy, a fair pay agreement, and not even detail on that. And I would like to put that to Johnny Reynolds, who's still there. Johnny, why don't you have a bigger offer on social care?
Well, look, I think on all the areas that you have just run through, the reason that Labour's manifesto is correct in what it says is because it's making a big argument about the state of the economy and the need for the economy to grow more strongly to fund a whole range of public services. To be absolutely frank with you, if you were talking about social care, you could equally say the NHS, you could say crime, you could say the criminal justice system, schools, education, further education. If our economy continues as it has done for the last 14 years, there will be really tough decisions to make on all of those things. So I don't think you can even address any of those things in the long term unless you're talking about the economy, getting it moving again, better living standards for everyone. But I do think Labour's manifesto does that, whilst putting immediate money into key areas of public services like health and education.
And obviously one of the big ways you want to do that is to go really strong on planning reforms. I mean, are you really prepared to face down the NIMBYs on that?
Well, look, I think there are people here in the UK who are willing to hear an argument about how we address the housing crisis. I think, look, I know there can be very strong opposition at times. I think there's a bigger group of people who are simply worried after 14 years of failing public services about how additional homes would give the infrastructure in terms of health facilities, transport facilities that are necessary to go with that. And the Labour manifesto does cover that. It talks about how you will gain value from the uplift in land values that can come from planning decisions, how we can fund that in a way which is consistent. And I think there's a group of people who already see the scale of the housing crisis, and there's more people that can be won round by that. But if you want a direct answer, we're very, very serious about fixing this, and we will get to work on day one on housing to make sure we've got the kind of housing market we need.
I think you've also just been really honest about the scale of what you actually want to do. So you want to have a fair pay agreement on social care that isn't paid for yet in your manifesto. You want to fix doctor strikes almost on day one, which isn't paid for yet in your manifesto. You want more money for defence, which isn't yet paid for your manifesto. If you're being honest to viewers, yes, you've got this big plan for growth, but in your back pocket, there are options to raise money that you may need before that.
No, I think everything we have laid out, whether that is the change to taxation of private education in order to fund more money for state education, whether it is the changes to performance-related pay in private equity, or how the non-dom rules should change in a way that brings more revenue in, we've laid that out. What we have said in those things you've mentioned is, if the economy was growing more strongly, what would be priorities? Well, defence would be the first one. So we've given some indication of that, but we're clear. Get the economy moving if you want to fund those public services.
Very quick one. In 2019, Keir Starmer said he'd be proud if under a Labour government food banks were not needed anymore. Are you hoping to eradicate them?
Yes. I mean, I think we can all recognise the work that volunteers, particularly churches and faith organisations, do around food banks, but a well-functioning, healthy society would ideally have nothing like the dependence we've seen grow in the last 14 years. The growth in food banks compared to when I was first elected in 2010 has been one of the most astonishing stories of Britain. I can't tell you how quickly we can unravel that, but of course I'd want to see the root causes of poverty, inequality addressed in a way that returns us to the, I think, better society we were before the Conservatives came to power, and that is what politics should be. It should be public service, and the chance to serve is what Labour is asking.
Johnny Reynolds, thank you very much for your time. I'm sure you're going to pick up on it. Robert, I'm just interested in the first things he was talking about there around whether or not this will feel like an unfair result proportionally tomorrow, and whether Reform would deserve more seats if they get a result like the polls are suggesting.
I mean, it is absolutely fascinating, and maybe, you know, we'll talk a bit more about this later, that if these polls, and there were 4 of them out today, which showed an enormous Labour majority on the basis of a smaller share of the vote than Jeremy Corbyn got when he didn't win in 2017, and Reform potentially getting huge numbers of votes and, you know, a tiny number of seats at best. This would be the least proportional election result, I think, in British history. Very interesting, I thought, hearing Johnny Reynolds really not resiling from the idea that the system is not fair. I mean, all he said was that it would be great for Labour if they could win under this system, but at no point did he say it was a good system that didn't need fixing, which I thought was really quite striking. I mean, Ruth, what do you think? I mean, I was very struck yesterday. I don't know if you listened to Boris Johnson on the stump. It was a classic Boris Johnson speech. Part of it was, you know, you're an idiot if as a voter you don't vote Tory. And I just wondered if many people listening to that, you know, were going to think that was what they wanted to be told. But the other thing he talked about was, he kept saying, under our weird system, you know, Labour can have this enormous majority despite having fewer votes than he, Boris Johnson, got. And he was basically saying it was unfair. Is there any world in which the Tory party would campaign for a different electoral system?
Well, as the leader in Scotland, I've run elections with 4 different systems. So you've got first past the post for Westminster, the additional member system for Holyrood. When we were still in Europe, it was pure de Hont that we ran. And then for all local councils, it's STV. And I have to say that it doesn't matter what system it is. People know how to vote. I think you misjudge the electorate for thinking they're not sophisticated enough to know how to make their vote count. And we've seen the rise of tactical voting guides and other things. You know, people know what they're doing. And as much as politicians might like to say that the voters have got it wrong, they never do. They never get it wrong in democracy. That's what democracy is. But I think there are some weird things that first past the post throws up. So, for example, Theresa May raised our vote share by 5.5% and lost seats. Boris Johnson only raised it by 1.2% and put on a stack of seats. So, you know, it's not just how many votes you get, but it's also where they are. And that's, again, to do with the idea that people in seats know whether they're safe seats, whether they're bellwether seats, whether they're, you know, on the cusp, and they know what to do. And a lot of people choose to vote against a party or for a party. And you know, I personally, I love elections, and I will continue to fight elections from a much reduced base and from a much reduced position, but I'll fight them on whatever system the country decides.
Well, I want to make 2 points. One is you completely dodged my question, and second, it's been too long since I heard the phrase de Hont. But over to you, Anushka.
Thank you. Just before you speak to James again, I wanted to show you this exclusive data shared with us by Signify. It's looked at the top 1,000 most shared articles written by major news outlets this month. So that's things shared across platforms like Facebook, X and Reddit. They've then broken that down by types of articles and put them into different categories, and politics is quite big, but sadly not as big as these other categories like global news, royal family, culture and media, and top of the list, sport. Maybe not surprising given the Euros. Maybe that's why Keir Starmer keeps going to football grounds, and some newspaper endorsements are quite football themed. Earlier this week, the Mirror came out in support of Keir Starmer with this headline: 14 years of hurt never stopped us dreaming. And today, The Sun: it's time for a new manager, and we don't mean sack Southgate. I thought it was quite interesting that that there was no picture of Keir here. James knows lots about media, politics and sport, having written plays like Ink, Labour of Love and Dear England.
I think I should probably point out that you mentioned there's no picture of Keir, but they are backing Keir Starmer. That's what that front page means. James, lovely to have you here. As I was saying earlier, you wrote, I thought, a completely gripping play about Rupert Murdoch when he took control of The Sun. Now, there was a time, and you'll remember this, as I say, because of your other play about Labour, Tony Blair cared so much about getting the endorsement of the Sun newspaper. He flew all the way to Australia about a year before to appear at a Murdoch conference just to sort of woo him. Do you think these days the endorsement of a newspaper like the Sun matters very much at all?
I think the debate has always been over whether or not these newspaper endorsements reflect the mood of the country, or do they guide the mood of the country. I suspect they're mainly reflecting what they think the mood is, because they're commercial entities and they're trying to tell newspapers.
And in the old days, Murdoch doesn't control the Sun anymore because he's stepped back a bit. But in the old days, the view was that Murdoch simply wooed power and wanted to be in with power, and that's what it was all about.
It was an influence. And obviously, Murdoch is a businessman. He likes to think of himself as being relatively ideologically neutral. He wants deregulation, and he's all about the profit. So, but I think the famous one was 1992, wasn't it, where they believed it was the Sun what won it, and then stole the election away from Kinnock towards John Major. I suspect we over-exaggerate, and possibly I'm guilty of this, because in storytelling you want an individual's choice to be the reason why history pivots and changes. I suspect more often than not, newspapers just get a sense of the way that the mood music is changing and reflect that instead.
I mean, you are this brilliant storyteller. I loved your play, Dear England, about the revival of the England football team under Gareth Southgate. My sense in watching the play was that you rather admire Gareth Southgate. How did you feel in the early rounds of this contest we're watching the England team in, where it felt as though the whole country was turning against Gareth Southgate.
Yeah, I was really surprised. I mean, every single fan is allowed to feel what they feel and feel disappointed if the football is not good. And the football has not been good, and English players and the manager has accepted that. I think what worried me is that in previous tournaments, what Gareth Southgate had identified as one of the problems of the England football culture was the amount of negativity, that the joy had gone, that something about the amount of pressure and expectation we place on England players in particular make the England shirt particularly heavy, and that increases the fear of players. So they made mistakes, they wouldn't play as a team. Famously, we were the worst in the world at penalties. We used to take them quicker than any other country in the world because we were scared of them. And what I do admire about Gareth Southgate, and I think this is applicable actually to the political situation, is that he wasn't afraid to identify some really quite frightening problems at the heart of the machine that was going wrong, ask some unapologetically quite philosophical, existential questions about identity, culture, how the weight and the burden of English history, because there's so much of it, was putting extra pressure on the England players. And he had this long-term plan, which you see so rarely in politics these days. He decided that, he's almost like a playwright, he decided it was got to be a 3-act structure, that we weren't going to put pressure on ourselves to win the very first tournament that he played, that we were going to win the third one. And that meant he could tell a longer story that we could all understand. And moment by moment, we could see clear progress being made. And we did. Whatever people think about that sort of softer approach as a football manager that Gareth Southgate has done, semi-final, final, quarter-final, and at least quarter-final this time is an historic amount of success. And if you compare that to other areas of our national life, it's the famous Reagan thing, isn't it? Is your life measurably better this time than it was at the beginning of the last term? All the metrics in the past few years that should go down have gone up, and the ones that have gone up have gone down. Generally speaking, there's been areas such as at certain parts of our education and I guess employment's been relatively strong, but waiting lists are up and productivity is down, social mobility is down, prison population is up. All the bad lines are up and all the good lines are down. People feel that, and I think Gareth Southgate understood the importance of writing a longer narrative and managing expectations. And that's why I was disappointed in the group stages, because so quickly we forgot some of those lessons and turned on our players really fast.
OK, I'm going to come back and talk to you a bit about the drama of football in just a minute or two. Don't go away. We'll be back also talking about the drama of politics. I'll be talking a bit more with James, but also with the joint leader of the Green Party, Adrian Ramsey. See you in a minute. Welcome back. Joining me now is the Green co-leader, Adrian Ramsey. Adrian, great to see you.
Good evening.
Climate change, I mean, is seen, especially by younger people, as you know, one of the most, and said by many people, the most pressing issue of our age. One of the things, though, that I am struck by, we're talking a lot about polls today, is that your vote share seems stuck at around 7%. It has been rising over recent years. But why do you think that you are sort of bumping along at that kind of level?
Well, I think, Robert, that the national vote share doesn't really reflect the Green Party support, because what we've seen over the last 5 sets of local elections is Greens increasing our councillor numbers 5-fold, and that's in all corners of England and Wales, rural and urban areas, winning seats from Labour and from the Conservatives in large numbers. And at this general election, we've got big strides forward in Green Party support as well, particularly in those places where we have big support on the ground, where we've got big concentrations of councillors, or where we have our target seats at this election. And in those seats which we're particularly targeting, and we've highlighted we want to get at least 4 Green MPs elected, in those seats on the ground, the support is fantastic. People know we're the main challenger to the other party that's campaigning there on the ground. And they know that getting a group of Green MPs in Parliament will push the new government that's coming in to be bolder, both on defending the environment and also on restoring our public services, where the Green Party is the only party being honest about the investment needed to restore the NHS, to support social care and to support our schools and teachers.
But there's also a tug, Adrian.
It doesn't necessarily reflect our ability to get a group of Green MPs elected in those places where we're strongest.
But there's also a tug in the opposite direction the Reform Party, which is, I mean, some would say they're climate change deniers. They are gathering probably twice the support that you are. We've got a Prime Minister who thinks there are votes in slowing down the measures that are needed to hit net zero. As I say, I'm quite struck that public opinion seems, if anything, to be going against you.
The people I speak to on the doorstep every day in East Anglia and around the country say to me that they want to see stronger action on the environment, both on climate and on nature, which have had very little attention in this election. I've called for there to be a proper climate and nature debate in this election, which didn't happen because there was only 10 minutes of scrutiny in those main debates on the party's policies on these issues, which doesn't give anywhere near enough focus. And what particularly frustrates me, Robert, is that high on people's agenda is the cost of living crisis in the economy. And if we look at the root causes of why people's bills are going up and up in areas like energy and food prices, it's because we're not taking the environmental action that we need. Because if we invest in renewable energy at scale, that's the cheapest way to produce electricity. If we insulate people's homes, that keeps bills down, keeps homes warm. If we support our farmers to produce more food locally, that means we've got a more resilient food system that's more protected against international economic changes and shocks in the climate. So we want a more resilient future that tackles the cost of living crisis as well as the environmental crisis. And people are saying to me on the doorstep all the time, they want action on those things, and they want a future where we're thinking about what the future is going to be like for our children and grandchildren. And more Green voices in politics will do that, both on the cost of living crisis and on climate.
But the problem, as you say, is there is a cost of living squeeze and people are genuinely concerned about the transition costs at a time when they've got little enough money in their own pockets. But I want to pick up something you said, which is if you get representation in Parliament, you will be using that representation to be putting pressure on the government. What single issue, if you get into Parliament, would you most want to push, to promote with... I mean, it looks as though it's going to be Labour, but whoever wins?
Well, the first thing I'd say about the transition costs that you highlighted is that the Green measures will bring down the cost of living for people because it's about those measures I talked about.
Yeah, but that's over a period of years, Adrian. But let's not get bogged down into the transition phase. Let's just talk about the single issue that, as I say, matters more to you if you are fortunate enough to get a number of MPs elected.
Well, Keir Starmer has backslided and U-turned both on investment in climate, and we will put pressure on him on that, but also on investment in public services. And we're only going to be able to address the huge crisis in our NHS and care system, the hospitals that are overstretched with patients in corridors, people not being able to get an appointment when they need one in hospital or with a GP or with a doctor. So we're going to be pushing for people to be able to get that investment that's needed if we're going to restore our NHS. I'm not sure anyone thinks it's realistic that those problems are going to be addressed without significant investment. And we're the only party that's been honest in this election in saying there are ways in which we could raise more investment from the very wealthiest in society, modest changes in our tax system that could raise tens of billions by the end of this next Parliament and would enable us to restore our services. So being a champion for restoring services that have been lost in rural and urban areas alike, and pressing the government to use the levers it does have to actually restore our NHS and build our care system will be a crucial priority for Green MPs. And
it's very, very, very brief because we're almost out of time. You, like Nigel Farage, think that the current electoral system discriminates against you. Could you work with Nigel Farage to try and reform the system? Just straight yes or no?
Well, I'd work with whoever wants to improve our democracy, and that's not about whether it's right for any one party. It's about whether it's right for the voter and every vote counting equally. But this week, we're on track for the best ever Green Party results under the voting system we have now, including a group of Green MPs to push the new government to be bolder on the issues that really matter.
Adrian, great to talk to you, and I hope you'll come back after the election.
Indeed.
I mean, can I just sort of quickly pick up actually with both of you? Climate change is already not only damaging, well, it's damaging pretty much the entire world. It's visible. Everybody knows about it. And yet it hasn't played at all in this general election to any meaningful extent. I mean, I suppose two things. Ruth, does that disappoint you? Are you surprised?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the public, absolutely everybody wants the best possible environment. but nobody wants to be told that it's going to cost them money or that there's going to be hard choices and they have to change their life to get it. And I think it comes back to what Anushka was talking about as well, about difficult subjects not getting airtime. So social care is an intractable problem. It's the third rail of politics in this country. Nobody has found a way or has come up with an idea of how we can make it work and depoliticize it at the same time. So I think there have been choices that have been made by both main parties to avoid things that are too tough a pill to swallow.
And I want to ask you,
and I think we are. I think that is a disservice to the electorate, yes.
And I want to ask James about this, because you were just saying about how Southgate decided he was going to plan for the long term, and he made some difficult decisions and he stuck to it. What's the lesson for our political leaders? How do they do that?
I think I would say this, wouldn't I, as a dramatist, but I think you need good storytellers and really clear stories. And there's something, I mean, the fact that the green issues, and I firmly think that climate change is higher up on voters' worries and fears than it's being understood to be. And of course, it got sucked into the culture wars of things, isn't it? Where you have to pick, if you're on this side of the culture wars, you have to say, oh, it's not really that bad. And if you're this side, you do. It is really serious. But I think how as politicians, you find a narrative that isn't about, to solve this, we're going to have to take things away from you and it's going to be negative. It's got to be a more positive story about how we change for the better.
James, Ruth, that programme flew by. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. That's it. Anushka and I will be on ITV1 from 9:50 tomorrow till 6 a.m. and we're back on Monday night to evaluate the first actions of a new Prime Minister. I wonder who he or she will be. Well, it won't be a she, will it? We know that. Tune in to find out. Goodbye.